will focus on the following key areas: genocide and war crimes, a detailed examination of Israel's systematic violations of international humanitarian law and expanding from Gaza and now into Lebanon, legal accountability and international law, and the failure of the international community to enforce legal consequences for Israeli war crimes, and the growing disregard for the Geneva Conventions. Thirdly, Western complicity and arms trade, how military and diplomatic support from Western alliances, particularly arms sales, embolden Israel's crimes and prolong the suffering of Palestinian and Lebanese civilians. And fourthly, escalation toward all-out war. Israel's unchecked actions are crossing all red lines and pushing the region into full-scale war, exacerbated by the unwavering backing from certain Western powers. I would like to please welcome our esteemed panelists, Saeed Ibrahim, Chris Gunness, Ambassador Masoud Maleb, Jeff Halper, Ferris Boyes, Professor Michael Link, and Aidan White. Thank you. We'll start with Saeed Ibrahim.
Thank you, Lisa. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good evening, or maybe good morning, or maybe good afternoon, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished colleagues, speakers. First of all, thank you for this opportunity to address such a critical and urgent issue, one that not only shapes the lives of millions of Palestinians and Lebanese, but also tests the conscience of the international community. But before that, on top of my mind now, and perhaps in every decent human being's mind, is to strongly call on all parties in the Middle East, especially Israel and its allies, to urgently de-escalate the heightening tensions that are destabilizing the region and disengage in an all-out war. As mentioned by Anwar Ibrahim, our Prime Minister, Malaysia's Prime Minister, the continued aggression and attacks by Israel in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen are deliberate attempts to divert the global community's focus from its brutal atrocities and acts of genocide against Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. This escalation is plainly aimed at keeping Israel's current political leaders in power and out of prison. It is also sacrificing innocent lives at the altar of one man's political career. He said, Anwar Ibrahim also said that we must urgently prevent a dangerous cycle of action and reaction, which threatens to draw even more parties into the conflict and further deepening instability and broadening the scale of destruction. And he therefore urged all concerned parties to take immediate action to reduce hostilities and establish conditions necessary to prevent a broader regional conflict from erupting. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we all understand that the situation unfolding in Gaza and now extending into Lebanon is nothing short of catastrophic. For decades, Israel has conducted operations that can only be described as acts of genocide and war crimes. According to international law, genocide refers to actions intended to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious groups. The persistent airstrikes, the illegal blockade of Gaza, the targeting of civilian infrastructure, hospitals, schools, residential buildings are stark violations of the Geneva Conventions. And as the most recent figures shows, the death toll in Gaza has surpassed 41,000 Palestinians, with more than 96,000 injured. In Lebanon, hundreds, perhaps thousands of civilians have already been killed in Israeli airstrikes targeting southern Lebanon and also central Beirut. Entire neighborhoods have been flattened and key infrastructure has been devastated. Israel's expansion of military aggression into Lebanon is further proof of its disregard for international humanitarian law. The deliberate targeting of civilians and the systematic destruction of critical infrastructure are clear indicators of Israel's broader campaign to destabilize and control the region. The failure of the international community to also hold Israel accountable is a stain on the global legal order. Despite clear evidence of war crimes, the UN, the International Criminal Court, and the larger global system remain ineffective in imposing consequences. Israel enjoys near total impunity. This growing disregard for international law undermines not only the Geneva Conventions, but the very principles of justice and human dignity. Repeated violations have gone unanswered, even with extensive documentation by international human rights organizations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. The global legal apparatus has failed to act. Israelis' actions have been met with international condemnation, yet words without action are hollow. The selective application of international law breeds injustice and emboldens those who perpetrate atrocities. Ladies and gentlemen, Israelis' aggression is not occurring in isolation. It is crucial to acknowledge the role of Western powers, especially the US, in perpetuating this cycle of violence. Military and diplomatic support from the Western powers, nationally, particularly the arms trade, have emboldened Israel to carry out its military operations with impunity. We have real knowledge about this, that Israel has received over perhaps near to 4 billion US dollars annually in military aid from the United States. And it's not just, a few years ago, but it's also recently. And it is used to purchase advanced weaponry, and it's being used. The US Congress approved millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars in precision-guided weapons in 2021 alone. The UK has also sold over 400 million pounds in arms to Israel since 2015, including fighter jets, missiles, and surveillance equipment. These weapons are not used for defense, but for the deliberate targeting of civilians and the destruction of vital infrastructure in Gaza and in Lebanon. This complicity not only prolongs the suffering of Palestinians and Lebanese civilians, but also undermines global peace efforts. And we talk about, ceasefire. We talk about these things, but the attacks, the airstrikes are still happening even as we speak. The silence, or worse, the tacit endorsement of these actions by Western alliances sends a dangerous message that certain nations are above the law. The military and financial support provided by these nations is a critical factor in the continuation of these war crimes. The arms trade between Western powers and Israel is an industry of death, and this must be recognized if there is to be any hope for peace. Ladies and gentlemen, we now face the possibility of an all-out war. Israel has crossed all red lines, and without accountability, this aggression will only intensify. Unconditional support from certain Western powers exacerbates the situation, allowing Israel to escalate its actions without fear of consequences. The region is on the brink of full-scale war, and the international community must act decisively to prevent further bloodshed. What is happening today is more than just a series of isolated incidents. It is part of a larger plan to further destabilize the region, and the failure to hold Israel accountable has paved the way for a war that could engulf the entire Middle East. The longer we allow impunity to reign, the more we endanger not only regional stability but global peace. Ladies and gentlemen, as a Malaysian and a member of parliament, I want to affirm our country's firm stance on this issue. Malaysia has consistently called for the protection of the Palestinian people and an end to the illegal occupation. We have supported international efforts to hold Israel accountable, including through boycotts, sanctions, and calls for arms embargoes. Malaysia believes in the fundamental rights of the people to live in dignity, in safety, and in peace, and we reject any form of apartheid, colonialism, and oppression, of course, genocide. It is our moral duty to speak out and act against the injustices committed by Israel. But our responsibility does not just stop there. We must also work with the other countries, particularly those in the global south, to build a united front that demands justice and accountability. And I think, I know it is kind of hopeless, and a lot of people are quite frustrated when they see that peace efforts have not moved, when they see that the peace efforts have not, gained any fruits, and at the same time also that atrocities are still going on. And therefore, the time for action is long overdue. Malaysia stands ready to play its part. Our member of parliament are here. I'm also together with the member of parliament from the Southeast Asia, from Malaysia, from Thailand, from Indonesia, and the rest. And we're together. That it is not just enough for one country to act. The global community must rise to meet this challenge, and for the sake of justice, for the sake of peace, and for the sake of protection of human dignity. Therefore, I call upon international bodies, governments, global civil society, and also our speakers here to also intensify our resistance, condemnation, and protest against the atrocities committed by the Israeli regime in Palestine and in Lebanon. It is crystal clear that Israelis' actions are inhumane, disrespectful, and violation of the principles of peace and justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was again Saeed Ibrahim, the chairman of the Malaysian Parliament, Caucus for Palestine. Thank you so much for your words. I realized that I had forgotten to add, we have about a 5 to 7 minute time for everybody to speak. There's quite a few people here, and thank you so much. Thank you so much for your kind words. And next, we will be hearing from Claudia Webb. She is the British former MP. Claudia? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I hope that you can hear me. And I just want to say hello to everyone, and for all who are joining us from across the world on this important seminar. I'm delighted to be with you today, and I look forward to a positive and informative discussion. The International Criminal Court Chief Prosecutor, Karim Khan, application to the court for arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant lists as their crimes starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, cruelty causing great suffering and serious injury, murder, deliberate acts on civilians, extermination including by starvation and persecution. These descriptions only scratch the surface of the appalling reality of Israel's crimes. Now Israel is extending its crimes into Lebanon, using the same tactics of the mass killing of civilians and destruction of homes and infrastructure, and adding outright terrorism, both in its use of hundreds of booby-trapped devices, a clear crime under international law that killed and maimed thousands, and in its mass bombing of densely populated residential areas, reportedly using more than 80 buster bombs in a single attack on a 6 residential tower block. The excuses Israel used in Gaza hold no water in Lebanon. There are no Hamas, there is no hostages, and the claim that Israel has to kill civilians because its targets are using them as human shields is exposed. Because the Iranian attack on Israel's Mossad base showed that it is based in a densely populated residential district. It could hardly be clearer that the Israeli regime holds international law in utter contempt, expecting to bomb, kill, and invade with complete impunity, targeting schools, hospitals, journalists, all war crimes, and inflicting starvation and disease on millions. Many nations have risen against this, calling for sanctions and legal action against Israel and its enablers. Some in the international community are doing far worse than merely failing to impose consequences. The US, in particular, has been accused of pressuring the ICC to drop its war crimes case and refuse Karim Khan's request for arrest warrants, saying openly that it will not arrest Netanyahu or Gallant if they are issued, and with Israel threatening consequences for officers of the court if they proceed. All this makes a mockery of the so-called rules-based order, showing that some lives matter more than others and that some nations expect to be able to do whatever they want without consequences. Those nations are attacking the very concept of international law with the potential for even more horrific consequences in the future. According to our UK Prime Minister, Israel has a right to self-defense, but Lebanon does not. Israelis have the right to be safe. Palestinians do not. Iran can't launch missiles into civilian areas. Israel can. None of this is coherent. Much of the West, in terms of its governments, has colluded in Israel's crimes. The US and UK have provided political cover, persisting in describing war crimes as Israel's right to defend itself. This is unabashed arrogance, turning a blind eye to genocide or even trying to prevent the slaughter being designated as such, while they, along with Germany and others, treat peaceful protesters as violent criminals to be brutally suppressed. My country, the UK, is waging legal war on journalists and activists who expose and criticize Israel's actions. The same countries are actively colluding in the act of mass murder. They're complicit, providing weapons, spare parts, technical and logistic support for military attacks on civilians, attacking Yemen and allegedly providing special forces to assist in the targeting and execution of attacks. The British public are very clear. 84% of the British public think Netanyahu should be arrested if he comes to the UK. 67% think Israel has committed war crimes. 56% support in all arms sales Israel. The British public are on the right side of history. Our political leaders, however, are not. This inexcusable collusion in Israel's war crimes prolongs and directly contributes towards the suffering of the innocent people of Gaza and now Lebanon. Protecting Israel and its regime from the full force of the consequences of their actions, emboldening its racist leadership on its ambitions to control the whole region, and its attempts to provoke a reaction from its Muslim neighbors that will bring the US fully into a regional war, spreading suffering in the region and intensifying the threat to the whole world. Instead of Western nations fulfilling their obligations under international law to prevent genocide and war crimes, which they have the power to do in days or weeks if they want to, through sanctions and the end of arms sales and military support, our governments are fueling it and extending it. If this world was just, International Criminal Court in The Hague would be very busy in the next few years. And if the peoples of the world unite against criminality, corruption, and warmongering, it still might. It's going to be up to us, the people on the right side of history. Solidarity to all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudia. There was a question that came up. I would like to ask, as coming from the UK, and what is important that the international community and specifically people in the UK can do to prevent Israel from all-out war?
We continue to have to do what we've been doing. We've been marching in protest and trying to enable our political leaders to listen, to understand effective punishment is a war crime. Starvation is a war crime. We protest and march, and we try to bring our government to understand these realities. We join with others across the world. As civil society, we're very clear. As I've indicated, the statistics couldn't be clearer about the civilian population and what they see as war crimes and what they believe our governments need to do. We need to end all arms sales to Israel. We must stop this now. The British government says it cannot end the component part of F-35s because that will spoil the supply chain. That's the point, however. We need to end our component part so that F-35s do not and cannot rain down on the people of Gaza and now Lebanon.
Okay, thank you very much. So that question is actually for everyone. What can the international community do to prevent an all-out war happening from Israel's push towards an all-out war in the region? If you can add that in as part of what you're talking about, that would be great. As you pointed out, Claudia, there's been a lot of pushback from governments against pro-Palestinian protesters. And so if you can, many people are wondering this question, what more can we do? So thank you. And we'll move on now to Chris Gunness, who is the former chief spokesperson for UNRWA.
Thank you very much, Lisa.
Okay, you have about 5 to 7 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. And hello to the audience, and it's an honor to be on with such a distinguished panel. Hello to all of you. I would like, if I may, as the former spokesperson of UNRWA, to talk from a peculiarly Palestinian perspective. Full disclosure, of course, I'm not Palestinian, but unlike many Palestinians, I have been to all 5 areas where UNRWA works and where there are Palestinian communities. Sadly, the world has salami sliced the Palestinians, so they can't get a sense of being a community. They can't travel around these 5 areas. The reason I say this is because we tend to think of the current conflagration as having different theaters. There's the Lebanon, the northern Israel, there's Gaza, there's Syria, there's Iraq, there's Iran, there's the Houthis. If you're Palestinian, it's an interconnected conflagration. You have what's going on in Gaza, which many people see as redolent of the Nakba itself. Of course, it's 3 times the Nakba. 750,000 were displaced during the Nakba, and this is possibly over 2 million. The latest reports from Gaza, there's a Cambridge University and UNRWA report that says that the education of young people and children has been set back by 5 years, not just because of the current conflict, but because of previous conflicts and of the impact of COVID. We now have a generation without hope, without any economic prospects, and many of them without homes. On the subject of homes, the Norwegian Refugee Council has today issued a report. They are trying to get kits for shelters, for building homes in Gaza. As you probably all know, more than 75% of the housing stock has either been damaged or completely destroyed. The weather in Gaza, many people don't know, actually gets very harsh at this time of year. It's very cold and can be very wet. At the moment, Israel is allowing in 2 trucks per week with these kits for building houses. And if we are going to get enough into Gaza by November, when the weather becomes very severe, we have to get 25,000 trucks per week. So that, I think, gives a scale, gives an impression, an idea of how far behind we are on that. On health, according to the latest UNRWA update, 19 of the 36 hospitals in Gaza are completely out of service, and of the 17 that remain, most of those are operating severely under capacity. I would also like to say a few words about food. We have a situation now where pretty much all of the UN agencies working there are talking about starvation. And as I keep telling people, starvation is like a locomotive. You can put your foot on the brakes, but it will carry on down the track quite a lot further. And I have no doubt, as has the World Food Programme, the World Health Organization, that hundreds of thousands of people in Gaza are now facing starvation. The reason, if you're Palestinian, you see this as joined up is because what the Israelis are now doing is taking the lessons of impunity, which they've learned in the last year in Gaza, to Lebanon. So we're seeing mass forced displacement of hundreds of thousands of people. The IDF is simply saying to whole towns, you have hours to get out because we're about to bomb you. Yesterday, we had in the center of Beirut, very near the Lebanese parliament, a health clinic being hit. And the Israelis said, well, we think it was run by Hezbollah. In fact, it wasn't. But the idea that you can hit a health clinic because, as in Gaza, it may have some affiliation with the Hamas health ministry, or in this case with this school because it has some vague association with Hezbollah. Israel is being allowed to get away with impunity. What it had applied in Gaza, it's now applying in Lebanon. And if this war does go any further, and heaven help us if it does, I think the same sorts of rules of engagement will apply in Iran and wherever else the Israelis decide they will hit. Now, the question of international justice is an important and interesting one. And it's been asked in the chat, and while it is very easy to be cynical and very skeptical, and quite rightly so, about what's happening in the ICJ and the ICC, as you know, the ICJ adjudicates disputes between states and issues advisory opinions. The ICC is all about individuals. I do public advocacy, and I can tell you that what has happened at the ICJ is nothing short of miraculous from the point of view of public advocacy, because in a recent advisory opinion, the world's highest court said that the Israeli occupation must end, it's illegal, and that no member state of the United Nations can take any action, military, economic, diplomatic, you name it, it cannot support illegality. I'm here to tell you that that is the position of the BDS movement. So in one fell swoop, the highest court on this planet has made it an obligation on all UN member states to adopt BDS. The bar is now up here. And whereas we all know the occupation is not going to end, well, within 12 months, as the General Assembly has demanded, or within 6 months, as the ICJ has demanded, it does mean that people who are involved in public advocacy, in critiquing government policy, like my own government, we can now ask them with a straight face, why are you not implementing the BDS movement? And its demands for a total boycott. Similarly, ICC, I mean, I can tell you, my day job is to work on Myanmar. And in Myanmar, there was a genocide in 2017 against another Muslim population in northwestern Myanmar. And there has been a lot of investigation by ICC investigators. There has not been even any discussion about an ICC arrest warrant. And although I hear cynicism when I discuss these issues, the ICC arrest warrant with people, at least we've got to the point where Benjamin Netanyahu we hope if the pre-trial chamber gets on his side of history and does the right thing, he may well be arrested. And we can ask the British government, if he comes here, why aren't you going to arrest him? So again, the public advocacy, the parameters around which we can now discuss this. Sorry?
Oh, sorry, 30 seconds.
30 seconds. Well, very lastly, I mean, the attack on UNRWA. UNRWA is being attacked operationally. The Israelis are withholding visas. UNRWA is being attacked in terms of its finances. It's not being allowed to have bank accounts in Israel. The donor community has now come back, apart from the Americans. And what I would say is this is an attack on the Middle East peace process by Israel. This is an attempt by Israel to say the refugee issue cannot be part of the Middle East peace process. Effectively, that fatally undermines the Middle East peace process. And beyond that, what we're seeing is the notion of land for peace being fundamentally flawed. Land for peace, by the way, is the basis upon which we're saying to Putin, you can't have the Eastern Donbass. It's a fundamental principle in all interstate relationships. And if we're saying to Netanyahu, you can acquire land and you can acquire land by force, and you get away with that scot-free, that is the signal that we're sending to the rest of the world. We are tearing up the rule book. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the significance of this attack on UNRWA. And that is why I think we all have to do everything we can to make sure our governments do not allow UNRWA to be thrown under the bus, because the implications of that are huge, and they're huge for the rest of our planet. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Next, we are going to hear from Masoud Malouf. He's the former Lebanese ambassador. Masoud?
Yeah,
Thank
thank you
you.
very much. Thanks for including me in
You'll
this
have
excellent
about 5 to 10
panel.
minutes, about 5 to 7 minutes.
All right, thank you. And thank you again for including me in this important panel. I say hello to everybody. And let me start by saying that since October 8th, 2023, almost 1 year ago, Israel has been conducting a destructive war on the Gaza Strip that has been described as a genocide, war crimes. In fact, it looks like a genocide. It sounds like a genocide. It is developing like a genocide. Then it is a real genocide. When most of the infrastructure of the Strip is destroyed, including houses, schools, hospitals, government buildings, and more than 41,000 Palestinians have been killed, most of them being civilians, then it is definitely a genocide. When Netanyahu started the war on Gaza, he announced two goals: the destruction of Hamas and the liberation of the hostages. Then the carnage, the ethnic cleansing, and the genocide started under the false claim of defending Israel and fighting terrorists. After failing to achieve any of his objectives in Gaza, Netanyahu turns towards the West Bank, where his army, the West Bank, where his army supported the settlers in their attacks against the Palestinians, chasing them out of their homes and destroying their crops and olive trees. Soon afterwards, he sent his army north towards the border with Lebanon, announcing a new goal for his war: the return of 60,000 Israelis to their homes in the north, returning 60,000 Israelis by displacing more than 1 million Lebanese, and this is his equation. In order to achieve that, he declared that he needs to push Hezbollah away from the border and to the north of the Litani River. In the last 11 months, Hezbollah's support of Hamas in bombarding some military targets in northern Israel, no Israeli civilians have been killed. Hezbollah fully respected what was called the rules of engagement. During that time, Israel was conducting airstrikes and bombardments of Hezbollah fighters, targeting them in their homes throughout Lebanon with total disregard for civilians. Israel also destroyed homes and killed at least 600 people, including numerous women and children, all of that before mid-August. Then Netanyahu started his savage campaign against Lebanon with exploding the booby trap pagers and walkie-talkies used by Hezbollah, which killed numerous people and wounded thousands, including innocent bystanders who lost their eyesight or limbs. This was followed by air raids on numerous areas of Lebanon, destroying buildings and structures that the IDF pretended were occupied by Hezbollah fighters. What Israel is doing in Lebanon resembles to a large extent to what they did and are still doing in Gaza. The ethnic cleansing and the genocide perpetrated by Israel in Gaza prompted the South African Republic to bring the case to the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. Numerous countries joined South Africa in this case. The ICC judges are now studying the request of prosecutor Karim Khan to issue an arrest warrant against Netanyahu and his war minister Yoav Gallant, as well as some Hamas leaders. In trying to face these legal issues, Israel has lobbied the American Congress to put pressure on the International Court to dismiss the case, arguing that Israel is not a member of any of these two international courts. But despite Israel's obstructing numerous initiatives for a ceasefire, they're ignoring every request by the United States to open the borders for humanitarian aid to enter the Gaza Strip. Biden and his administration kept sending arms and money to Israel. The question that comes to mind is, why isn't the international community stopping this genocide and ethnic cleansing? And why does the United States keep sending arms and money to this rogue state that has completely ignored US pleas? It is worth mentioning the double standards of the Western countries led by the United States. With Israel's devastating attacks on Gaza and Lebanon, we heard many mild statements calling on the parties to reach a ceasefire and to stop fighting, but not a single clear condemnation of Israel of this act, despite the huge number of civilians killed and the widespread destruction. However, when Iran attacked Israel without killing a single person and merely causing limited damage, the condemnations from Western countries were loud and clear, including some direct threats to Iran by the United States. Let us now talk briefly about the international community and then the United States. First, the international community, quickly. The countries of the global south support the Palestinians and do not approve of what Israel is doing, but they have no influence on Netanyahu to pressure him to stop his attacks on Gaza and Lebanon. On the other side, the Western countries outside the United States have made statements calling for a ceasefire and ending the war. Some of them, like Spain and Ireland, have even recognized the Palestinian state. Other Western countries, like the UK, have put an embargo on selling some types of weapons to Israel, but this is absolutely not sufficient to deter Netanyahu. Remains the United Nations. In the Security Council, the American veto has prevented any resolution forcing Israel to stop the war from seeing the light. In the General Assembly, a resolution calling on Israel to end its unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory was adopted. However, this resolution, which was adopted by an overwhelming majority, is not binding. In fact, everybody knows that only the US can stop Israel. So I have a lot more to say, but I will stop here.
Thank you. And I wanted to thank all of our hosts. I would like to thank everybody for attending who has not yet spoken. I know that this is time is passing, so I want to thank you all for being here. It is so much a privilege and an honor to be able to hear all of you. Next, we have Jeff Halper. He is an American Israeli anthropologist, author, and political activist. If we could please keep the time to write about 5 minutes, and again addressing what can be done, what the global community can do right now. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. And yeah, I'm speaking from Jerusalem. I'm the head of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions and have been involved with the Palestinian issue for many, many years. I really don't know what to add. I mean, even my friends on this panel seem to have their doubts about the efficacy of international law and the whole so-called rules-based international order. I'm not an international lawyer. I'm a political activist more, and so I kind of share that. And international law and human rights conventions and the UN have really had very little to do with my political work over the years, because it really doesn't fit in. It really hasn't. It helps, it's true, in terms of public advocacy, the ICJ and the ICC and UN resolutions and so on. But beyond that, it really doesn't help us very much. And in a way, we're kind of in a parallel universe, because Israel and Zionism and the whole settler colonial movement that is Zionism until today has developed, conquered Palestine, driven out half the Palestinian people, created an apartheid regime, and is now headed towards normalization. That's what Gaza, the attacks on Hezbollah, and finally the attacks on Iran are all about. And that is to finally, after 130 years of Zionism, to normalize the facts on the ground that Israel has created, together with not only with the United States, but with the wider international community. I mean, people talk about the global north. The global south has been complicit as well. I want to remind you that Israel is a major trading partner with China. And China has notably been missing in this whole in what's happening, in the Middle East. Israel's, I think, the second or third major trade partner to India. So that the whole BRICS, except for South Africa that's been active, the others in the BRICS, and of course, the new members of BRICS, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and so on, are complicit in the normalization process. It's Saudi Arabia that wants to normalize with Israel with American support. It's the Emirates and Egypt and Jordan that have normalized with Israel. So this is far beyond some American manipulation of a client state that's doing what it's doing with impunity against the international system. In fact, this is really an international effort to support a settler colonial regime. And the reason for that, and that's what maybe we should have another discussion really around what the issue is. And that is that there is no international rule-based order. There isn't. The world is run on a transactional basis. Transactionalism is the way it is. And that is that there are no alliances, there's no grand strategies, there's no human rights, there's no commitment to international law or international institutions. Everything is done on a transactional, immediate, win-lose kind of a basis, mainly bilaterally among states. Everybody for their own interests. And in that kind of a system, that's why I'm saying we live in a parallel universe, because what can we do in that system? Israel thrives in that kind of a system because it's irrelevant. The impunity doesn't come from the fact that it's protected by the United States only. It comes from the fact that there is no way to enforce, as we all know and we've all said, there's no way to enforce international law or the rules of the system. And we have to remember also that Israel, as a settler colonial regime, was created by the United Nations. In 1947, you had the partition plan where the United Nations gave 56% of Palestine to the Jews, who were newcomers in the country and had no legal claim, obviously, to Palestine. So it's really in a sense, Israel has been able to use itself, the international system, and UN decisions and this rule-based idea to promote its own case better than we've been able to use it against Israel, because the system has actually supported Israel all these years. So from my point of view, the real question is, and I'll just end on this because I mean, there's a lot to say, but most of you have said, what I would say as well. I think your analysis is right on. I think the whole issue is how does, and this is one of the questions that was asked before, how does the international civil society, the people, all of us, influence policies of governments that run completely independent of us, that run on their transactional basis, that have no regard, and almost Jimmy Carter was laughed out of office as president because he tried to make human rights a guiding principle of American foreign policy. So this is laughable. How do we, the people, and I agree that the vast majority of people do support Palestinian rights and really are against absolutely what Israel's doing, maybe even against Israel's existence, as a Jewish state. We're in favor of one democratic state in the region. But the real question is, in this transactional, non-rules-based order, how do we, as civil society, make our voices heard and make our position and influence policy? A couple hints came out in previous discussions. One is targeted campaigns, not necessarily human rights campaigns, but a campaign against supply lines. The whole idea of interrupting supply lines, and that's been done. There are several fuel ships that have been targeted by BDS groups and forced to divert and not be able to dock in Israel to deliver fuel for jet airplanes. So supply lines is one thing, we have to brainstorm on this. But that, for me, is really the question. And I apologize that I'm not addressing the question of this meeting, but for me, the real question again is, assuming that there is no rules-based international order, how do we, as civil society, influence government policies and actions? Thanks.
Thank you very much. That was quite informative. So next we have Professor Michael Link. He is a former UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories. Thank you, Professor Link.
Thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be on this panel with such distinguished speakers and with this organization. I'm going to push back a little on some of the comments been made. I will disagree with Chris Gunness. I will agree with Jeff Helper with respect to comments on international law. I don't believe we should be starry-eyed about international law, and Exhibit A, as to where it doesn't work, obviously is the Middle East in general and Palestine in particular. But I do believe that legally, under international law, we have what we need largely in terms of trying to regulate conflicts, in terms of trying to ensure rights are given to people and they can exercise those rights. What we lack, which I think we all would acknowledge, is the issue of international resolve. International law only works not by itself, but when it's married with international resolve. And that's the important issue. I think we should be building up international law and our faith in it. After all, international law is the promise that states make to each other and to their own peoples with respect to a range of rights and agreements that have been put into place, particularly with regards to human rights. And I think in any system, whether it's a domestic system or an international system, we always have a struggle between law in the service of power and law in the service of justice. And for those of us who are equity seeking or justice seeking, it's our duty and responsibility, I think, to be able to push to increase the boundaries and the space available for law in the service of justice with respect to this. So what I want to talk about in the few minutes that I have is I think, the importance of the decision by the International Court of Justice in July with respect to the Israeli occupation that several others have mentioned before me. I want to talk about it in a little more depth, because I think we now are at the edge of a new paradigm governing Israel and Palestine. The prior paradigm, even though we've had lots of UN resolutions, we've had previous decisions coming from the International Court of Justice, really the driving paradigm always was realpolitik. That's what informed the Oslo process all the way through from 1993 to the present, where it was based on power and that Israel could negotiate from a position of strength and the Palestinians were forced to negotiate from a position of weakness. What the decision of the ICJ portends for us is that we're now going to move instead to a new paradigm of a rights-based approach to Palestine and Israel. The court said a number of things very clearly, and let me just briefly go through them. It said, first and foremost, that Israel's occupation and its ongoing presence in the occupied Palestinian territory is unlawful. A new breakthrough with respect to this. We've always known that aspects of the occupation were unlawful and illegal. We now can say that the entire occupation itself is unlawful and illegal. And therefore, the court said that Israel is under an obligation to end its presence, its unlawful presence in the OPT as rapidly as possible and completely, right back to the 4th June 1967 lines. Israel's under an obligation to stop all settlement activity and to evacuate all of its 740,000 settlers who are living in East Jerusalem and the West Bank illegally. Israel, and this is one of the points that has been often understated or overlooked, but one of the most important parts of the ICJ decision is Israel has an obligation to make reparation to the Palestinians caused either to people themselves or to legal entities such as organizations that are concerned in the OPT. And all states have an obligation not to assist or aid in any way with respect to Israel's continuing occupation and its unlawful presence that is there, and that the court then went back, said to the United Nations General Assembly, who had asked for the advisory opinion, that it itself, the General Assembly, should consider the precise modalities and further action required to bring to an end as rapidly as possible Israel's unlawful presence. And we saw that manifested then 2 months later, as was mentioned by one of the previous speakers, by the overwhelming vote by the General Assembly, 124 nations in favor, only 14 against, and 43 abstentions, where they welcomed the decision of the ICJ and said that it actually gave a timeline of 12 months from the date of the passing of the resolution. So the diplomatic clock has now begun to tick, and the alarm will ring and ring loud next September with respect to this. None of us on this panel are starry-eyed enough to think that Israel will suddenly comply with this. It's going to take obviously popular will and more determined state action to help make that come through. But we now have, if you like, international law with crystal clarity saying what has to happen. And if I can just end with respect to this, because I know we're trying to keep within 5 minutes. Martin Luther King Jr. once famously said that the arc of justice bends slowly, but it bends towards justice. And I've always admired that. But then I was told that Reverend Jesse Jackson had an addendum to that, which we should keep in mind. He said, yes, the arc of history does bend towards justice, but we have to make it bend to make it so. And I think that's incumbent upon all of us in terms of taking action. And certainly what I think this gift of a ruling from the ICJ and the subsequent endorsement of this ruling by the UN General Assembly has made our work that much easier. We have to work in the realm of law, but mostly, and most importantly, we have to work in the realm of politics. And knowing how crystal clear international law is on this will make our campaign work in the realm of politics and diplomacy that much clearer for the path ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael Link. That was Professor Link. That was very informative. Lastly, we have Aidan. Oh, I'm sorry, my timer just went. Lastly, we have Aidan White, who is the founder of Ethical Journalism Network. Aidan White, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much indeed. First of all, again, thanks for being able to take part in this discussion. It's been very rich, and I have listened intently, and I've been inspired a couple of times, and I've sighed deeply a couple of times as well. The fact of the matter is, and I want to take up Michael's point about the value of international law and its importance. It's certainly true that over the past 70 years, there has been the construction of a really important human rights structure, which, as a post-war consensus, we hoped has been able to deliver protections of fundamental human rights. But I think he's too optimistic. And I think there's a certain naivety about believing that more laws and the existing laws, and I do agree with him that the existing laws are adequate. I do believe that's right. Certainly from my perspective, I see that. But where I think the naivety is in believing that almost naturally the political will be found to actually transform the neglect and negligence of democratic countries over their responsibility to enforce international law into suddenly a new mood of willing enforcement and enthusiasm to do so. I speak on behalf of journalists who, over the past many years, understand very well that the protections they're offered through the Geneva Conventions and recently the numerous resolutions that have been adopted by the United Nations is not worth much in reality. The fact of the matter is that in the past year, we have seen 130 journalists and media workers, many of them targeted and deliberately killed on the spot in Gaza. We've had 224 human rights defenders or humanitarian aid workers, also some of them targeted and killed. And the application of international law to protect them has not entered at all. There are 6 cases of targeted killings and assassination of journalists which are going to be going to the International Criminal Court. That's welcome. But there is no prospect that that is going to deliver the sort of justice that is necessary. But the fact of the matter is, for journalists in particular, the situation it finds itself, we found ourselves in Israel and Gaza now is not new, by no means. For decades, Israel has been killing journalists and media staff with impunity. A report by the Committee to Protect Journalists last year revealed that in the last 2 decades, 20 journalists have died at the hands of the Israeli Defense Force with no accountability, complete impunity. So the targeting and killing of journalists, which we've seen in recent months, really makes it very, very clear that these are crimes of war that need to be addressed. But there's a second problem here. And it's not just the individual and personal tragedies of journalists and their families who are the victims of this abuse of international human rights. It's also the full frontal attack on the right of the people to know what is going on in the region, not just in the region, but internationally. The fact that Israel has imposed effectively a blockade on the international media community in their ability to get into Gaza. The fact that they mount consistently disinformation campaigns whenever they are called to account. All of this indicates that the war against information, which is seeking to explain what's going on, to give background and to tell people, to give them some sort of glimmer of hope that they are being fed information that they can trust, is not on Israel's agenda at all. So I think that these issues are extremely important. We have international law, we have the Geneva Conventions, we have the mechanisms in place, but they are not enforced. And I think the point that Jeff makes about the transactional nature of rights being available is an important one. The fact of the matter is, where have the successes been in the application of international law in recent years? Inevitably, they have been in Africa. They have been in the Western Balkans. We have seen international justice, certainly regarding information and communications, being applied. But we are not seeing the international community, particularly the democratic community, willing to call Israel to account. And this is important. The difference between Israel and other countries in the region is that Israel, on the moral high ground, calls itself a democracy and demands to be taken seriously as a democracy. And so therefore, it has a special responsibility to try to defend those principles of democracy that are under attack. And yet we see Israel in practice and in effect calling into question the democratic principles and being abusive in their work. I just want to finally deal with a question which you put to us, Lisa, which is the question of what on earth can we do about all this? It's a good question. I think a lot of people feel powerless in the face of what's going on. And it's certainly true. There's not much that individuals can do. But one of the most important strengths that we have in civil society, both nationally and internationally, are the networks that we are part of. We as journalists are part of international networks of journalists. And what we do is we work together to protest and defend and promote the interests of journalists. There are international networks of teachers, of lawyers, of doctors, of workers, of people who have common interests from country to country, who cross borders and who can actually work with each other. It's really important, it seems to me, for us to get away from this sense of powerlessness, to use our networks, to register our opinions, to call for action, both politically at a national level, but importantly, internationally. If that happens, and if it's done effectively, then I think that let's say the optimistic position that Michael puts, we could see coming nearer. But I think the most important thing to do is to move away from this sense of powerlessness and to get back into thinking that there are things we can do and to come up with an agenda for change which we can put before our politicians and call on them to act. Thank you very much.
That was very powerful. Thank you so much. That was what you spoke to about people feeling powerless. I hear a lot of that, and so I think that is very insightful. That our strengths in our networks, our strengths are our networks and communities. Thank you to all the panelists. This has been an absolute honor and a privilege to be here and hearing all of you and your extraordinary and powerful words on, equity, a future that is better than what it looks like today. I would like to open this up to about 20 minutes of discussion. And I wanted to again kind of go back to how Aidan finished up. Many of us are feeling powerless, and as I hear many people from my communities and networks, this is pretty much the consensus. And people want to know, especially with the recent Israeli aggression, is what do we do as an international community? What are our practical steps? When this webinar clicks close, what can I go back and, what can other people who are listening, what can we promptly walk out our front doors, sit down at our computers, pick up our phones? What can we practically do? Because it looks like Israel is pushing for an all-out regional war, which I don't think any of us want. So, what are your insights on practical next steps? I'll go ahead and if everybody wants to take maybe can take maybe a minute or two to respond. Yes, please, Masood. I'm so sorry, you're on mute.
Okay. Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. We know very well that the United States is the only country in the world that can influence Israel seriously. But unfortunately, we know that President Biden and his administration now in this electoral year are not in any position to do anything. So I think what the Arab Muslim communities in the United States can do is put pressure on Kamala Harris, the candidate of the Democratic Party. President Biden is now at the end of his political life. He is leaving on the 20th of January of next year, and his legacy is now as a very weak president, especially in front of Netanyahu. So what we can do, what the Arab community can do, is try to pressure Kamala Harris in taking some positions. For instance, it's not enough for Kamala Harris to try to say that, speak about the two-state solution, the necessity of the ceasefire, and also the civilians that have been killed. Kamala Harris has to say clearly that in case she is elected president, one of her first activities would be to make a community, a delegation, an American delegation that would start working with Israel on the two-state solution, pressure Netanyahu to accept the two-state solution, pressure the Knesset Israeli on changing his position on refusing the two-state solution, and also take some position saying that if Netanyahu keeps killing civilians and destroying civilians' houses, the United States will stop sending arms and sending money and covering Israel in the international instances. This is something that the Arab community, the Muslim community, and many African Americans can do in the time left for the elections. The elections will take place in 1 month and 2 days. There is still a little time to do that, but I am not very optimistic that Kamala Harris will be able to retrieve and to get back the Arab and Muslim voices that have abandoned President Biden and the Democratic Party because of their position blindly supporting Israel. Okay, that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I am from the US, and those are questions that we are grappling with over here. Thank you. Would anybody else like to comment on the question?
Can I add to something I said earlier? I mean, I can see the importance of political pressure, and there's no question at all that the United States and the attitude of the United States is absolutely critical and crucial. But I think it's very, very important that what we try to do is we try to spread and this discussion, this debate. I think there are areas within the European Union where I think the debate really needs to be raised. The political institutions there, I think, need to be taken up. I think in the United Kingdom, which has been referred to earlier as a country which is riding alongside the United States and giving support with very little critique to Israel and its current actions. I think there's important work to be done. You will know that in the recent election, the ruling party now, the Labour Party, paid something of a price over its failure to be very clear in its attitude towards the breaches of international law and crimes of war in Gaza, by the failure of that party to be able to mobilize fully the Muslim communities in the United Kingdom. And that should have been a warning that there are divisions being created, which really we need to move away from them being religious or ethnic divisions, that we need to have a discussion and a debate which is about the defense and promotion of human rights and values and human values, so that we don't get bogged down in ghettoized discussions and debate which will only increase divisions. One of the things I think that's also important is to recognize that actually inside Israel, there are communities, Jeff will know this extremely well, there are communities that are extremely critical of what's going on, are extremely anxious about what's happening, and it seems to me there needs to be a reaching out to that community within Israel as well. There are many Israelis who are very, very much troubled by what's going on and want to be part of the debate about how to move things along, change the government, get a completely new approach. So there is a lot that can be done. And I think that recognizing the need for political action in our local communities, more support for pressure on political forces, simple matters like recognizing the value of boycott of materials that are coming from the settler community in the occupied territories. Issues like this are extremely important where everyone can get involved. So I think there are things that can be done, and one hopes that one can generate and movements are making progress in the United Kingdom, for instance, that one can generate enough support which will push the political community into action.
If I can just add to that, and again, I think this comes from, if you like, the gift of international law and what was said in July by the court and what was reaffirmed by the General Assembly in September. There are two particular areas where we as citizens, as civil society organizations, can push our governments with the clarity of the court and the General Assembly's direction in mind, is not to give aid or assistance with respect to Israel's operations in the occupied territory. And that focuses, I think, on two main areas. Number one has to do with the settlements. The settlements could not exist without both being regularly infused by both national, Israeli, oxygen and international oxygen. There is an extraordinary amount of money that goes, particularly from North America, but also I think from Europe as well, in the form of either a corporate investment or charitable donations or simply private gifts of money going to the settlements that keeps them growing, keeps the industrial parks that support them growing, builds the highways that get settlers into jobs in Tel Aviv or in Atniyat or in Jerusalem. We have to I guess, create a list of what governments have to do in order to ensure they crack down with respect to this. And the second thing, obviously, is weapons sales. Weapons sales has begun to move, first haltingly and then a little bit more robustly, but there still are extraordinary areas of weapon sales in North America and Europe going to Israel that's continue the flow. Obviously, the heart of this is the United States, but there are important components of this in Canada and Europe as well. Political pressure in Canada meant that Canada did not renew any of its weapons sales agreements with Israel. And then subsequently down the line, 2 months ago, Canada took the position of trying to end the sales of weapons components manufactured in Canadian manufacturing plants that are going to the US for the finished product before they go off to Israel. This has not made a big dent with respect to Israel, but I think this winds up growing, and it tells us that BDS can wind up working with respect to Israel, if only we wind up putting, I guess, our shoulder to the wheel and pushing on issues such as this.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to speak up?
I might add just one word. Normalization is the way settler colonialism triumphs in the end. In other words, it conquers, it displaces, genocide is built into settler colonialism, and so on. But it's only when it becomes normal that it's over, basically, where there's a closure. And that's, like I said, that's where Israel is going now. I think this is the process. Now, normalization could not take place without the so-called moderate Sunni states, the Arab states in this region. And, it's interesting. The Muslim and Arab communities have been very outspoken in terms of Palestine, of course, both on the street and also in more organized ways. But it's always against what Israel's doing. It's against now, obviously what's happening in Gaza and even Iran and so on. It is not directed at all towards the Arab states. In other words, what if there was a mobilization of the Arab and Muslim peoples and governments, like Malaysia, for example, that would say to Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and Jordan and Egypt and Morocco and the other Arab countries, do not normalize with Israel until there's a just resolution of the Palestinian issue. That's a completely missing component in all of this international organization. There is no pressure put on Arab countries. They're like outside of the discussion completely. Now, they're pretty immune from any kind of pressure, being as autocratic as they are. Their own peoples can't really speak out. I mean, there were attempts to try to organize protests against what's happening in Gaza and Egypt, and they were shut down pretty quickly. So I think there's a special role to be played by Arab and Muslim governments and peoples outside of the Middle East, where they do have that latitude of protests and raising their voices directed towards the Arab governments, because normalization cannot happen. Whether Israel wants it or the United States wants it or Europe supports it, it cannot happen without the complicity of the Sunni Arab states. And I think that's a tremendous source of leverage that hasn't been exploited until today.
Okay, was there anybody else that wanted to make comment? Okay. So if everybody has finished, and I'll give one last question. Did anybody have any more comments? Oh, okay. I will go ahead and close this out. I want to thank all of you most graciously for this fantastic and very enlightening conversation. I will go ahead and close this out, and hopefully conversations like this can continue in the future, and this will be an ongoing conversation as communities and networks are able to come together to put humanitarian rights in the focus.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Have a good evening.